Hi there, I'm Todd Leet, and welcome to U.S. History with Leet. Today we're going to talk about the Revolutionary War, but first, let's go ahead and find this PowerPoint and all my notes. Go ahead and fire up those browsers and visit www.toddleet.com. Once you're there, you'll go ahead and find all my materials, but we're in U.S. History right now, so click on U.S. History, and that'll take you to the page that has all these notes. You're looking for unit number 5, the American Revolution. We're on PowerPoint Part 1. So go ahead and click on that. It'll open a brand new window, and there you can find the PowerPoint that I'll be using today to go over the American Revolution Part 1, Leaders Rise. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and start talking about this PowerPoint, the American Revolution Part 1, Leaders Rise. And as we do so, we need to think about these big questions I've kind of come up with here, which is, how is it that 13 separate colonies, each of them have their own governments, their own histories, their own economies. They're all very, very different. And we've talked about they're even different regionally, New England, middle, southern colonies. I mean, with all these differences, how is it that they set those differences aside, they come together, and they fight as one against Great Britain, which is the most powerful nation in the world at the time. Great Britain has the largest navy, the largest army. They've got the largest economy, which means they have more money than anyone else, which means they have more resources to fight this war than do the 13 colonies. How is it that these colonies can come together and fight this war? That's what we're going to talk about. We want to talk also about the main political and military leaders during the Revolutionary War as well. Not just the guys on the battlefield, although Washington and friends are certainly interesting, but also the people behind the scenes who are pushing toward independence and coming up with our first government. That's something we want to look at as well. Really, the big question though here is, what is revolution? Because we call this the Revolutionary War, but do we even stop to really think about what revolution is? Revolution is, by definition, a forcible overthrow of a government or social order in favor of a new system. So forcibly overthrowing, so like purposefully going out and getting rid of the existing government or status, social order, like the way things are working, in favor of a new system, a new government. And that's what this is. But also you may think of revolution as like change. And that's really what the American Revolution is. It marks a giant change in world history, really. Obviously, you can't deny that America has been, a force for good on planet Earth since its creation, and this is where that begins. At the end of the 18th century, the 1700s, Great Britain is the most powerful nation in the world. Again, militarily, economically, culturally, Great Britain is the most powerful nation. But with the creation of the United States, it's not that Great Britain immediately ends like that, but it's kind of the beginning of their end, which is, America begins to ascend, and Great Britain will eventually begin to descend. And there'll be a flip of, which country is the number one nation on Earth by, pretty much the end of World War I. Certainly by World War II, America is the preeminent nation on Earth. In the middle of the 1800s, though, America's economy eclipses Great Britain. So first, we eclipse Great Britain economically, and then eventually politically and militarily. So where does that start? Well, it starts with the Revolution, which is, what we're going to start talking about here today. All right, so let's go ahead and recap. The last time we got together, we had talked about how the Revolutionary War had started at the battles of Lexington and Concord. Lexington, where we have the shot heard around the world. However, we now know, thanks to history unfolding, that was the start of the Revolutionary War. But at the moment, after it had happened, it wasn't quite clear that we were at war with Great Britain. Lots of people thought that this was just an isolated incident between, the Minutemen, the militia of Massachusetts, and the British Army. But certainly, lots of people didn't think that, we were on the way to war or independence. Independence is something lots of people aren't even thinking about yet. So, while we know now that this is the start of the Revolutionary War, in the moment, that's not quite as clear. So, we have that happening. Also, at the same time, you remember that we mentioned something called the First Continental Congress. So, after the Intolerable Acts, so you've got the colonists dumping all the tea in the harbor. King George III gets angry. He decides to lock down the harbor, start quartering soldiers in people's homes. And these are the intolerable acts, right? So the First Continental Congress is called. We got guys from all over the colonies that get together in Philadelphia, and they try to write a letter to the king to try and persuade him to back off of the intolerable acts and try and patch things up with him. They do that. They also decide that they're still going to boycott British goods. And then the final thing that they decided in 1774 was that they'd give the king a little time to receive the letter, think about it, see if he'll repeal the intolerable acts, kind of go back to the way things used to be. And if they hadn't gotten any response from the king, they decided that they would get back together in Philadelphia in May of 1775. So just to get our timeline straight. So we've got all the actions in Boston, including the Boston Tea Party, in 1774. Then the king gets mad. He drops the intolerable acts on the city of Boston. The First Continental Congress meets, and they decide to write a letter to the king and try to get back on his good side, and that in the meantime they're still going to boycott British goods. And they'll give the king some time, and if he doesn't answer by May of 75, they'll get back together again. So they send the letter, they wait to hear from the king, and then you have, the winter. Okay. Then in April of 1775, that's when Lexington and Concord happen. Then in May, the Second Continental Congress gets together. And that is a bit of a problem because since the last time these guys met, we've got Lexington and Concord having happened. So not only now are these guys meeting for the Second Continental Congress to discuss what do we do now that the king didn't answer our letter, but now they've also got to decide what's going on here. We've got these militiamen up in Boston who are openly fighting the British and have surrounded the British in the city of Boston. So they've got to decide how to handle that. So at the Second Continental Congress, we've got a lot of guys that were there the first time in the First Continental Congress back again. So you've got George Washington and John Adams. But there are some new guys that show up at the Second Continental Congress that were not there the year before in the first. And that's John Hancock, Ben Franklin, and a very important character in our story coming up, a young lawyer from Virginia by the name of Thomas Jefferson. So all of these great minds are meeting in Philadelphia, and what they've got to figure out amongst themselves is, one, we've got these militia guys up in Boston surrounding the British Army. What are we going to do about that? Two, the king has not answered our letter. How are we going to handle that? Do we write him another one? Some guys are starting to talk about us just, breaking off and becoming our own country. That seems a little extreme, doesn't it? So these are ideas that are being debated by guys, together. Lots of people think that we can patch things up with Great Britain, that just because a couple dozen people have died up in Boston, that it's not worth us throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's not worth us, breaking up with Great Britain forever just over, some taxes. That's what some people think. Other people like John Adams, they think, we should pretty much go ahead and go for a clean break here. It's time to start our own country. Clearly, the king doesn't really want anything to do with us, so why should we stay loyal to him when he's got his soldiers shooting at us? But it makes sense that, John Adams would say that because he's from Massachusetts, but not everybody's from Massachusetts. Lots of people from, southern colonies, lots of people from middle colonies, they're not ready yet for independence. So that's something that they're going to debate at the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Again, that starts in May of 1775. In fact, I got here that even John Adams, he suggested that the colonies all declare their own independence individually and set up their own government. So instead of having like one country where it's 13 states, like we know we ended up doing, Adams' idea is that we create independence of 13 separate countries. Pennsylvania would be a country, Massachusetts would be a country, New York would be a country, Virginia would be a country. That was a pretty extreme idea to start with, let alone this early in the process, so that's not going to happen. The other thing they got to figure out is these militiamen, the minutemen, who attacked the British at Lexington and Concord. Well, the second battle was Concord, right? And that's a win That's a win for the Minutemen. And they chase the British back into the city of Boston. And what they've done is they've surrounded the city of Boston, like ringed the city. So Boston obviously is on Massachusetts Bay, so it's got water, on one side. So the Minutemen are now stationed outside the city, and they've locked in the British Army. And these Minutemen are not really, well organized, but they've got the high ground. And in the meantime, a group of guys have actually gone out to a British fort in New York called Fort Ticonderoga. And with nobody being killed, these American guys are able to capture the guns of Fort Ticonderoga. So it's what's pictured here in my slide. So Fort Ticonderoga is this British fort that overlooks the Hudson River, and they've got these great big guns positioned on the outside of the fort, pointed at the river. So these colonists, led by a guy named Ethan Allen, they go up to Fort Ticonderoga and they steal the British guns, and they bring them all the way back from New York to Boston, and they park these things on the hills overlooking the city of Boston. So the British, now they're in the city, and outside the city on these big hills looking down into the city are their own guns pointed at themselves, put there by us, the colonists. So those guys need some leadership. We've got to figure out what we're going to do. Either they're going to let the British go, or we're going to attack them, or something. So we've got to do something here. Not everyone is ready for war, but these guys need some leadership. And not everybody's ready for independence, but we better do something. So there's a lot of things to be discussed at the Second Continental Congress. So one of the great questions that the Second Continental Congress has got to consider is what to do with the Massachusetts militia that has surrounded the British Army at the city of Boston. So the British soldiers, they retreat into the city. The militiamen surround the city, taking the hills above Boston, and now they've laid siege to the city of Boston, even grabbing those guns we mentioned from Fort Ticonderoga and pointing them at the British. But there's really no organization. To this militia. It's just a bunch of ragtag guys who are, part-time soldiers, but full-time bricklayers and merchants and lawyers and doctors and farmers and drunks. So there's no military order amongst the militia. So they're talking about what to do. Should we send somebody up there to kind of organize these guys? And so they decide to do that, to appoint a general of the Continental Army, someone who can kind of get the ranks in order and get these guys trained, get these guys coordinated, so that if we are going to have some sort of war, which we haven't really decided that for sure, but if we are going to have a war, someone's in charge militarily. So they're debating, who should we send to Massachusetts to take over and be the military leader? And amongst them, a member of the Second Continental Congress is a 43-year-old veteran of the French and Indian War by the name of George Washington. So Washington is there not because of his military experience, but Washington is in the room because he's a rich man. He's a plantation owner in Virginia. So he's got wealth, he's got fame, he's got some power because he is a landowner with a fortune. And so he's there. He's there as a member of the Virginia delegation at the Second Continental Congress. But unlike everybody else who is in attendance, Washington is wearing his old military uniform from his French and Indian War days. And he would never outwardly campaign to be the general that would, lead these guys, because Washington was very, very conscious and did not want to ever seem desirous, did never want to seem ambitious. Washington never wanted to be seen as someone who was trying to go for fame or fortune, never wanted to be seen as somebody who was ambitious. But he was all those things. Washington was an incredibly ambitious individual. He just didn't want anyone to think that. So anyway, Washington's sitting there every day, wearing his military uniform as a silent reminder to these people that he has military experience and he's willing to continue to serve, even though it's been years since he was in the French and Indian War. It's 1775 now. So they're debating who it should be, and John Adams realizes that it needs to be somebody who's not from Massachusetts, because if we're going to bring all of these colonies together on the same page, it really would look good if someone from outside of New England, especially Massachusetts, someone from outside of New England was in command. So he's going to nominate Washington. So he nominates George Washington. The guys, they take a vote, and they pick Washington to be the first general of the Continental Army. And Washington stands up, and I give the quote here. He says, "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." Very humble. Very humble. Not exactly true. That's what he wanted. He wasn't sitting there every single day wearing his military uniform out of coincidence. He was a very rich man. He had other clothes he could have wore. He wore the military uniform because he was silently campaigning for this job. This is what he wanted. He's a soldier, and that's what he wants. And so Washington is now selected to be the first general, the guy in charge of the Continental Army. Even though he's a Virginian, he's going to go lead these Massachusetts guys as they surround the British up in Boston. And maybe this turns into a war, or maybe not. We haven't really gotten there yet, but we're certainly on our way. All right, let's start talking about some Revolutionary War battles. Now, I really believe that the average person doesn't need to have an encyclopedic knowledge of every single battle that takes place during every single war, especially the Revolutionary War. But I do think that there are a handful of battles that you do need to know about because they have important influence on the outcome of the war. So I think you need to know Lexington and Concord, because that's the battle that starts the Revolutionary War, where we have the shot heard round the world. We're going to talk about this one here in a second, called the Battle of Bunker, or Breed's Hill, as it's properly called. I think that's an important battle because that is a no turning back sort of point. Other battles that you need to know include the one that's a turning point in the war, where America is on the way to winning, and then I think you need to know the final battle of the Revolutionary War, where America gets the W. We'll talk about the last two here pretty soon. But first, let's talk about this one here, the point of no return battle, the Battle of Breed's Hill, sometimes referred to as Bunker Hill. You'll sometimes see the name Bunker Hill used in television or movies. You'll hear it referred to that sometimes in some older history books. But it's a name confusion thing. They thought the name of the hill was Bunker for quite some time, but this battle takes place at a place called Breed's Hill, so not that important. Anyway, so this takes place in Boston. So we last talked about the Massachusetts militia has surrounded the British Army located inside the city of Boston. They're down lower elevation near the water, and the militia have surrounded them on the outside, overlooking the city on these hills. And the British Army's down below with these guns pointed at them. So this is before Washington can arrive on the scene. After he's been appointed the general of the Continental Army, the British decide they're going to make a break for it. There's no point in sitting here waiting to get shot and killed. They want to try to break through these Continental lines and get out of the city and get themselves a W. So the British move out in this attempt to get free, and they're attacking a colonial position. The Minutemen have positioned themselves on top of this hill called Breed's Hill, and you never really want to attack a position that has elevation. You never want to march uphill to attack your opponent, because your opponent's going to have a much easier time seeing you coming, and they're going to have an easier time shooting you. And that's exactly what happens to the Massachusetts militia. They have a pretty easy time shooting the British as they march up this hill. I got a little painting here in my PowerPoint to kind of show this illustration. So you've got the British, and they're marching in full uniform. Full heavy wool uniform, carrying their muskets, they're carrying their mess kits, they're carrying their backpacks, everything. Even though they're not really going that far, they're loaded down with equipment and their firearm and just their very heavy wool uniform, and they've got to march up this hill to get to the position at the top where the colonials have positioned themselves. And it's just like shooting fish in a barrel. It's just too easy. And so the Massachusetts guys are just shooting the British just as fast as they can come up the hill, and they're pretty good shots. But even if they weren't good shots, the British don't, they're not doing anything to hide. They're just coming right at you in waves, and the guys on top of the hill are just shooting the British, and it's a bloodbath. And the British do wave after wave, and the Massachusetts guys at the top just can't believe that the British would just continue to come up the hill time after time again, despite the fact that they're just getting mowed down by the militia gunfire. And eventually it gets to the point where they run out of ammo. They simply they have the high ground, but they run out of ammunition, and they have to surrender the top of the hill to the British. So this is technically a win for the British. This is a British victory, but the British are forced to retreat because of the number of losses, the casualties that they take. They take 1,000 casualties in this battle. So again, a casualty is someone who's either killed in battle or wounded so bad they can't continue to fight. And the British take 1,000 casualties in the Battle of Breed's Hill. So it's a victory for them on paper. They take the hill, and they suffer losses, but they get the ground, right? But it's a loss also in a way in that all these guys die for nothing, basically, and the British are forced back into the city of Boston. And this is going to cause some consequences. So when I say that that this is a point of no return, when England finds out about this battle, that's it. They're not going to talk to us anymore. The flip side is the colonists. They see this as a victory in that, hey man, we could have won if we just hadn't run out of bullets and gunpowder. We can hold our own against the British. We have a chance here. We just got to rally around each other and just fight smart, and we can get the W in this thing. So it really emboldens the colonists. They see themselves get a victory, even if it's technically a defeat because they lose the hill, but they see themselves as able to stand up to the British, and it's almost a dangerous thought that they kind of luck out here. The British are not always going to be stupidly marching straight onto your fire up a hill. There's going to be days where they outnumber you. There's going to be days where they're just better than you. But that was not one of those days. So here's another idea. Before we get back to some more battles and stuff, around this time, not everybody is on the independence train. Not everybody hates the king. Not everybody wants us to fight this war. Not everybody has a problem with taxation without representation. Really the colonies are kind of broken up into three camps: Patriots, neutrals, and Loyalists. And so these groups are not really hard to understand, but they do need to be mentioned because history, at least by the way of media and movies, kind of gives you the idea that everybody in the colonies during the Revolutionary War was on the side of the colonies, and everybody wanted independence, and everybody was all in this thing together to fight the king. And that is certainly not true. Really, this war is fought by a small but very, very virtuous group of patriots. And the patriots are people who support independence from Great Britain. These people supply the Continental Army. They make up the Continental Army. They make up the government, the Second Continental Congress. That's the patriots. Those are the people that want America to become their own nation. On the flip side, you've got loyalists. There are a lot of people in the colonies, especially in the southern colonies, who sometimes they're called Tories. These people are loyal to Britain. They like the idea that we are, business partners and protected by the largest, most powerful nation in the world, Great Britain. They think that it's fair that we pay taxes because we are part of that country. And they don't want to separate from Great Britain. They might want to have lower taxes, but they're not willing to fight a war over it. They might want representation, but they're not willing to fight a war over it. They want to stay loyal to the king, and they don't want to risk what this war could cost them, which is their lives, their fortunes, all that. So, and there's a lot of people who are loyalists. There's a lot of them. We don't talk about them or see them in history because obviously the Patriots are the winners, but there's a lot of people who are loyalists. And then there's another group, and those are neutrals. Neutrals, they're just trying to stay out of everybody's way because they don't know which way this thing's going to go. They're a little wishy-washy, but what they're trying to do is put themselves in a position so that when this thing is over, they can go to whoever the winner is and still be on good terms with them. Because if the Patriots win this thing, the Loyalists are in trouble. When this thing's over, you're not going to want to be the guy who was against independence. You don't want to be the guy who fought against your neighbors. You're not gonna make friends that way. But the neutrals, if they just kind of sit in the middle and wait to see the way this goes, then when it's over, they could run over to either side and be like, "Yeah, America, we did it. We're one country. We broke free from that king," and pretend as if the whole time they were with them. If that's the way it goes. Conversely, if they kind of stay in the middle and keep their mouths shut, if the king and country wins and we stay part of Great Britain, then they could easily just go to the Loyalist camp and say, God save the king. Always wanted to be part of Great Britain. I'm glad we got those treasonous guys killed and stayed a part of Great Britain. So they can go either way, right? So again, it's not true that every single person in the colonies was a patriot and was trying to fight for independence. That's just simply not true. It takes a lot of people some time to come to that decision, and even during the war, not everybody's volunteering to fight. Not everybody's supplying the army. The Patriots are small in number. That's something people forget. And the same thing with the Loyalists. When this thing's over, they're in bad shape. A lot of them got to get on a boat and go back to Great Britain, or even go to Great Britain for the first time, because that's not where they're from, because they can't stay here having betrayed their neighbors during this war. So three groups of people, everyone's got kind of their own angle, kind of waiting to see how this thing kind of goes. But not everybody's on the side of independence yet. At the Second Continental Congress, you've got a lot of different characters. You've got guys like John Adams, who are fiercely in favor of independence now. Like, he shows up to the Second Continental Congress ready for independence. But not everybody else is. There's a lot of people who are more moderate, who believe that this relationship with the king can still be repaired, and that we don't need to fight for independence, but instead we could use the things that have happened as negotiating leverage with Great Britain to get ourselves representation in Parliament, fair taxes, so on and so forth. Not everybody's ready for independence. So Adams realizes, thanks to some good advice from Ben Franklin of Pennsylvania, that if we're going to go toward independence, we've got to get everybody on board. And you can't force people into independence. They've got to come to that decision on their own. And there's a lot of moderates who aren't there yet. And one of those moderates who's not there yet is an individual from Pennsylvania named John Dickinson. Dickinson's a moderate. He'll eventually come along to the side of independence, but not yet at this point. At this point, he still believes that the relationship with the king can be repaired. And so he asks the Second Continental Congress to prepare a letter for the king, an olive branch petition. An olive branch is an expression that just means you're trying to make up with somebody, you're trying to get back on good terms, you're trying to fix a relationship. So he comes up with this olive branch petition, and it's a letter to the King of England. And so I'm going to go ahead and paraphrase. This is not exactly what it says, but this is the gist of it. So in it, Dickinson's writing to the king. He says, "Dear King, listen, you've heard a lot of stuff about us colonists, and you might think that we want independence, and that's why we're having all of these unpleasantness with you. But that's not true. We don't want independence. We still love you, and we're very appreciative of what you've done for us, and we want to be members of your empire. But what we would really like, in addition, is representation in Parliament and fair taxes. So while we have definitely got a strained relationship right now, if we could just work together to repair it by giving us representation in Parliament, allowing us to pay the same percentage in taxes as people do in Great Britain, basically, giving us equal status to those who live in Great Britain, we'll put all this behind us, and we'll go back to being loyal subjects of yours, because that's what we want. We don't want independence. People may tell you that's what we want, but that's not what we want. So let's fix this relationship, because we still love you." Signed, hugs and kisses, the colonies. That's essentially what the olive branch petition says. Now, it's not going to work. And Adams knows this. Lots of guys know, but Adams especially. Adams says this is a waste of time. There's no point in us even asking the king. He won't even talk to us. He's not talked to us yet. Why is he going to start talking to us now? Adams knows this, but he's a realist. But not everybody realizes that yet, right? So it's important that we go through the motions, that we try to exhaust every avenue, that we do everything we can to stop. Not stop, but we do everything we can to make sure that we've exhausted every opportunity to put the relationship back, So they send the letter, right? And the king gets the letter from the colonies the same day he finds out about the Battle of Breed's Hill. So his military guys come in and they say, King, we got some bad news. Our guys suffered 1,000 casualties at this battle out there in Boston when they tried to attack a position that the colonists had held, and we lost 1,000 guys. The king hears this and flips out. And that makes sense. I mean, for the 18th century, 1,000 casualties in battle is a lot. That is a large loss. And so when the king hears this, and then they come in and they say, oh, by the way, we got a letter here from the colonies. The King George III says, I'm not reading that. There's no way I'm reading that. I'm done with these people. There's no more talking. They've said everything they have to say when they killed my soldiers. No, I'm not reading their letter. So the olive branch petition goes unread. King has no intention of reading it. He's not going to answer it. Not that he's answered anything else, but he's not going to answer it. And instead, he goes ahead and he puts out his own proclamation. And that is a proclamation in which he calls out the leaders of this rebellion. And he says that the colonies are in open and avowed rebellion, meaning like we are openly, without secret, and dedicated, avowed, to rebelling against him, the king, the legal authority, and that this is an illegal act, and that we should be arrested, and that everyone who is loyal to the king should make every effort to resist the work of the Second Continental Congress and the Continental Army. And once the guys find out that the king not only ignored their letter, but then put out his own proclamation, basically calling them all criminals, now they realize that we're now at a point of no return. Like, the king is not going to talk to us anymore. There's no point in trying to further negotiate with someone who won't even take your call. And those moderates now are coming along to the side of independence. So in our next lesson, we're going to start talking about how it is that we get independence. And we're going to start talking about how it is that we get the victory in the war. Because you can declare independence on paper. That's what the Declaration of Independence is. But that independence doesn't mean anything if you don't win militarily. You got to win on the battlefield for the independence to stick. And so that's what our next couple lessons are going to be about. That's what we're going to start talking about, is how do we actually make independence a reality, both as a document and militarily as well. Well, that'll do it for this lesson, The American Revolution, Part 1. If you found this video helpful, why don't you go ahead and click on the like button, or maybe even subscribe. You'll get notifications every time I push out a new video. In the meantime, if you want to check out my materials, including my PowerPoints, notes, and all the stuff I've made for all the classes that I teach, check out my website, www.toddlee.com. It's your home on the internet for everything Todd Lee. Until next time, this has been U.S. History Lee. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.